Welcome back to 1903 Spring Rule. Today's video is sort of a random info dump on things that come to my mind about the Japanese Navy during World War II, and basically is a mishmash of several Quora questions that I've gotten. So for starters, we're going to travel way back before, about 50 years before World War II started, right? Two competing school of thoughts. One of them is the Jeu Nicole. By the name you can tell that it is French, and I have probably I am danger close to France right now. So wish me luck. The second one is the sort of decisive battle theory. And I'm not going to explain too much about the Jeu Nicole, but decisive battle. War is fought between two naval powers. There's decisive battle. Whichever one wins that battle gains control of the sea. That's basically what happened during the Russo-Japanese War with the Battle of Tsushima. And Japan took the Battle of Tsushima and ran with that idea. A little bit later on, they're looking sort of worldwide. World War I just happened, and there's now the treaty system, which Japan was a signatory to. And what this did was Japan knew that they were never going to outnumber their enemies, that they were very dependent on strategic resource imports, and the treaty system put Japan at a disadvantage. The US and UK got way more tonnage than Japan did, and all of that tonnage was theoretically the same maximum capabilities. So you could have X amount of 16-inch gun ships, and then the rest were limited to 14-inch guns. Just because of weight, you couldn't really armor them as much as you wanted to. And Japan looks at that and says, well, how do we do this? We can't beat them numerically because of the treaty system. And the treaty system also broke the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty, which meant that Japan now had 10, I don't remember the exact ratio, Japan was 2.5, somewhere around there, versus 10 from the UK and US. So Japan isn't looking too hot. What they did was take Mahan's theory that so far had worked for them and said, well, let's continue developing that into the Kentai-Kessen Doctrine. I butchered that pronunciation, I'm sure. Basically, they wanted to pick a battle because they knew that as far as, industrial capacity, Japan was at a huge disadvantage compared to the UK and the US individually. So they go, well, what can we do? So they have this plan, and roughly it goes, submarines pick off as many ships as they can. Destroyers and cruisers do night attacks with our excellent torpedoes and pick off even more. And then there's the decisive battle, and we're going to have a secret weapon. Battleships with special 16-inch guns that are actually 18.1-inch guns. Hence the Yamato class. From here, it branches off into two different directions. I got a lot of questions about Yamato, and sort of a lot of questions about, or one question that I thought was very interesting on Japanese submarines. first, Yamato, because we're on the topic. Few questions here and there. So the theory behind them has already been explained. That big, huge battle, and you want whatever advantages you can get. So why did the night battles at Guadalcanal go Japan's way most of the time? Except for when they met the absolute Giga Chad known as Willis Augustus Lee. Well, Japan just had way better night battle doctrine because they wanted night battle with the enemy. So they were highly trained for that and knew it was sort of an equalizer. The issue is radar, and most of Japan's successes and surface actions during the early war came down to radar either not being in use, not being effective, or you have some idiot running it who doesn't know how it works, which happened on one occasion. And so there's that. That explains night battles. Radar gives theoretically a huge edge, but Japan was able to equalize early war while the U.S. was still groggy from peace. And then, how does this bring us to the Yamato class? Well, one of the last answers on my Quora profile is actually responding to a question about why did Yamato sink so fast? Basically, so Japan's decisive battles, or when they tried to force them, are, as best I can remember, 3. Midway, where the U.S. basically, through dumb luck, just happened to take out all of Japan's carrier fleet, or most of it. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Yamato got beaten off by... Yamato alone outweighed the entire U.S. fleet and still lost. So, obviously Yamato wasn't working out that great. So, and the war is, by this point, not going in Japan's favor by any stretch of the imagination. So they send Yamato on a one-way mission. They know and have planned it as a one-way mission. I believe it was Iwo Jima or Okinawa, one of those two. Take Yamato, run it ashore, bam, 18-inch one guns providing fire support, and basically being a fortress of steel. Sailors who aren't needed to man the guns and the ship go fight on land. So, a great plan to begin with. Send your biggest and best ship to die. Great planning to begin with. However, the U.S. says no. So what happens if you're in the history World War II sphere? You have heard various rumors of the mythical Type 96 25 millimeter. And Yamato's air defenses were basically all not that great. I mean, you have 18.1 inch anti-aircraft guns, which rocks, but they're not guided by radar. So what the US does is, at about noon, they pick up Yamato and just start circling while they plan. And that plan shakes out to be, 1, well, they don't have air cover, because why would you provide air cover on a one-way mission anyways? What are you, daft? The slight issue is there was no one to fight off the Americans, and Japan's anti-aircraft fire was, they shot down like 20 planes max. during the entire battle, and the US sent like 500. So obviously that didn't go so great for Japan. The US plan started off great by, oh, you have very ineffectual AA defenses. Cool, we're going to remove as many of those as we can. And so the fighters with full ammunition loads, because they didn't have any planes to shoot at, just strafed the daylights out of anything on Yamato's deck. So anti-aircraft gun emplacements, any sailors on deck, all of that gone. Just machine gun rocketed, bombed. And then while that's going on, you have dive bombers coming in from the top to do some damage, and also try to keep Yamato's eyes off the swarm of torpedo bombers approaching from her port side, which scored a couple hits. This didn't slow Yamato down, but it did some damage. And then the US just kept sending waves, and the second wave got, if I remember correctly, 9 torpedo hits. All on one side. So Yamato goes, I guess it's flipped for the camera, I don't know. Well, starboard port, it starts going whee, because it has like 11 holes at this point on one side, plus holes poked in the top that have done a ton of damage on the inside, which hampers damage control. And Yamato starts, whee. So what do? They counter flood to try to, stop it from going whee. This counter flooding kills hundreds of Japanese sailors on the starboard side. Not really a great move I guess it's a suicide mission. You don't particularly care about the men involved. But it sort of fixes it, but the damage is already done, and it slows the ship down even more. Now, Yamato's greatest weapon in this instance isn't her 18.1-inch guns or hundreds of anti-aircraft barrels. It is her speed and maneuverability, and every hole poked slows her down. Every bomb hit slows her down. The flooding slows her down because as you keep moving, you start flooding more. On top of that, the counter flooding has just taken out 1/2 of all of her machinery spaces, along with the men in them. So Yamato is basically now a sitting duck, and the US just keeps sending more and more planes. So eventually, the holes, despite their best efforts, the holes start, and the port side keep pulling her under and under. Eventually she capsizes, and then she explodes. According to some eyewitness reports, that explosion took US planes out of the sky, and was heard over 100 kilometers away. So yeah, that's the end of Yamato. What about her sisters? She had 2, or 1.5, sorry. Musashi also got overwhelmed by US air power on the fateful day known as St. Crispin's Day 1944, where Yamato got turned back by some very angry American destroyers. Great job. Yamato's efforts during the war can basically be summed up to 0 productivity. And yeah. And then there's Shinano, which brings us to the sort of second half of this video. Why were Japanese submarines so bad during the war? There's actually a tool, I'm gonna link it down below, which shows you a map of shipwrecks by country like some guy has gone through all of the records and put every single shipwreck from World War II on a map, on an interactive map. It is actually very cool. And if you look at it, you'll notice a distinct lack of, sunken ships between Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast. That is because of Kentai Kessen once again. So Japan basically kneecapped their own submarines because they said, well, save your torpedoes for warships, because you never know when the decisive battle is coming and you will play an important role. So they didn't really do as much as you'd expect them to. The US also had convoys set up in the Pacific, even from before the start of the war, oddly enough, with the Pensacola convoy. And so that's one half of the equation. Why did US submarines do so well? Well, Japan's anti-submarine warfare capabilities weren't all that great, if I'm being completely honest. So there's always the Mark 6 exploder, the infamous US wonder weapon, which by the time the Bureau of Ordnance had pulled its head out of its ass, it was now functional. They got it working after way too many lives lost. And US submarines just went on a rampage. I believe it was USS Tanks sank half a dozen ships in a matter of minutes. So US submarines were more aggressive, and basically if it flies a Japanese flag, it is gone. Unfortunate POW friendly fire incidents came out of that, unfortunately. But just look at the map and filter ships sank by the US, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Even in the Sea of Japan, they were doing work. And that brings us back to Yamato. Just as to give you an idea of sort of how the disparity of Japan's super weapons and Kentai Kessen versus the US. So Japan did have some successes off the US's western coast, a handful, but they did have them. And then you look at US successes off Japan's coast, and if you go 65 miles off Japan's coast, you can find the remains of the third Yamato class ship, which is Shinano. As it was cruising along on its first voyage out, USS Archerfish sees it and fires 4 torpedoes, all of which hit, sending her to the bottom, 65 miles off the coast of Japan. If memory serves, that is the largest ship sunk by a torpedo in all of history. The largest aircraft carrier sunk in combat in all of history. So yeah, one last thing before I start wrapping things up. Kentai Kessen didn't work, mostly because it was inherently flawed. So despite the fact that all of Japan's sort of decisive battles went the US's way, there's also the flaw of how does this win the war? Japan knew they couldn't win industrially. US submarines decimating Japan's imports, which they needed, especially oil. And so it was, you know, sort of, we win this decisive battle, we win this war. Russia didn't have too big of willpower during the Russo-Japanese War, but the U.S. got angry. How did Toby Keith put it? We'll put a boot in your ass. It's the American way. God rest your soul. And the U.S. was never going to give up. So Kentai-Kessen was never going to work. That's it for this video. I'm going to link, by the time I get this edited, it will probably be my birthday. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe. Let me know if there's any questions you have or anything you want me to cover. And also, if you want to see me, I write a lot more than I record, and I read a lot more than I do either of those things. If you want to see more of my musings on history, my core will also be linked in the description. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe. Take care.